Welcome to the Point. In the next 8 weeks, we will focus almost entirely on the upcoming election. This morning, we'll bring you one development on that front, but also spend time talking about another pressing issue in our state, and that's the budget for the next fiscal year that begins in less than a month. First, presidential politics. This past week, former Governor Rick Snyder, twice elected as a Republican, declared his support for Democratic nominee and former Vice President Joe Biden. While unusual, it may not have been totally surprising since Snyder, always a more moderate voice in the Republican Party, didn't support the Republican nominee in 2016 and refused to endorse the Republican candidate for governor in 2018. I started the conversation by asking how he came to his decision.
Well, Rick, it's something I took some time to consider. And actually, I spent time talking to my family and a number of friends and colleagues about the topic. Because again, I've stayed quiet the last couple of years, and this is a big step forward. To put it in a simple sense, there are several reasons, but the one that really drove me the most was, you know how I've been passionate about civility for many years, that we need to get along better as a country. And that was an issue back when I was governor. We've only become much more divisive as a country. I don't recall any time that we've been this divisive in my lifetime. It's scary. Because I view that as a threat to our very future. We're the greatest country in the world, but you cannot maintain that status if you can't get along with yourself. And when I looked at it, who's led the charge on making us more divisive? It's been our president. And I'm concerned about that continuing. So it was two steps. One is how did I feel about President Trump and how he's performed? And it was clear, I don't think that's been good at all. And I stated several reasons for that. The other piece, though, is that it's a different question to say, are you far enough along to say you can vote for the other candidate? And to be open with you, I had a positive relationship with the vice president. I've worked with him in the past. I believe he does want to heal our nation. And he's a good, decent person. And I believe he's going to listen. So I think there's an opportunity to make a difference. So that's why I thought it was important to speak up.
Well, it's an interesting choice, given that you served 8 years as a Republican governor here in the state of Michigan. So does this change your status? Do you still consider yourself a Republican?
Absolutely. I think the Republican Party, which has sort of become the party of Trump, needs to get back to the Republican Party more. Its roots and what we stand for, free enterprise, capitalism, smaller government, a lot of good things, individual liberties. I think that's gotten lost. It's become too much a party reflecting our president in terms of divisiveness and such. And a benchmark I did use, Rick, and I wrote this in the op-ed about how when I turned 18, I was in Kansas City and I was in President Ford's National Youth Group. That was a big deal in my life. And so one of the tests I used when I looked at making this decision is think about Jerry Ford. Other than the fact that saying they were both presidents, can anyone draw a comparison between Donald Trump and Jerry Ford to show how they have anything in common? I mean, as a West Michigan person, he's the antithesis of the leader that Gerald Ford was. Isn't that what we need in our country to get back to that kind of spirit?
Well, I too was at that convention, and there was a good deal of conversation about the direction of the party even then, as you well remember. So as you look at it today, you will vote for Joe Biden. You say you are in favor of smaller government. Do you believe Joe Biden is in favor of smaller government?
No, again, I think I'll have policy differences with him. I know that. But is he going to be a president that's going to listen, that's going to try to bring us back together and understand it's not just about representing the people that voted for you? Again, that's where I had great concern. And I had much more open mind back when Donald Trump was becoming president. I was at the inaugural, and I was actually excited to hear his inaugural address. Because I viewed this as a chance. Okay, we had the Clinton-Trump election, very divisive, very ugly. And here's a chance to bring the country together. Here's a chance to heal people. I sat there and listened, looking right at him. And I heard a speech that talked about how he was going to do things for the people that voted for him. And this is something I always took seriously. You know that. I tried to represent and do everything with passion I could for anyone that was a citizen of Michigan, whether they voted for me or not. That's the leadership that you should be doing if you have the honor and privilege to hold an elected office. Donald Trump has not done that. He's basically looked out for the people that put him in office and has not paid attention to the rest of the country. We can't have that.
Governor, in 2016, I remember during the primary, you said that you were not endorsing then candidate Trump. In 2018, you did not endorse the Republican candidate for governor, Bill Schuette. And now in 2020, you are saying that you're going to vote for the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden. And again, I ask you, you contend that you are still a Republican, but you don't support Republican candidates. How does that square?
I've supported lots of Republican candidates in that time frame. I was out campaigning for Republican candidates. I hope to continue to campaign for Republican candidates. It's one Republican candidate that I'm not going to be campaigning for. And again, I view that as an important issue that everyone has to look at their own life. But aren't we Americans first? I mean, I view myself as an American, and that overrides being a Republican to say I have to vote for every Republican candidate. If in good faith I can't bring myself to vote for someone, I may not vote for them. There's a second question to say, am I actually going to vote for the person running against them? And in this particular case, there is a compelling case in my view to say I should be voting for Joe Biden. And I'm encouraging other Republicans, I'm encouraging independents and people that are on the fence to say, this is not an election we should let go by. We need to be involved. At the same time, if Republican candidates want me to support them, I'm happy to get out and do that. I'm just a pragmatic person to know that a lot of Republican candidates now are going to say, we need to figure out, do we want to be closer or not to me, given the position I'm taking in this election. But long term, I'm going to continue to support Republican candidates.
Are you a part of, or do you intend to become a part of the Lincoln Project?
No. The Lincoln Project does not meet my standards for relentless positive action. It's a relatively negative group. And I don't support that, Rick. I still believe in relentless positive action. So I'm happy to be part of Republicans and Independents for Biden, because that's about telling a positive message about how we need to heal our country.
While there will be a big focus on politics, particularly presidential politics in the next few weeks, lawmakers in Lansing will be dealing with the idea of putting together a spending plan for the next fiscal year that begins October 1st. State Budget Director and former Democratic House member Chris Kolb talked with me about that process this week. Well, Director, I guess we'll start with this. There is good news, but still some bad news. The Revenue Estimating Conference suggests that going forward, the shortfall for the state's budget isn't as great as some had feared, but there's still a big hole. Tell me where we stand right now as we look forward to this budget.
Last week, we had a third Revenue Estimating Conference. It's not a usual thing to do, but because of the impact that COVID-19 has had on our economy and our revenue, we wanted to make sure that we had the best possible numbers going into solving this upcoming budget, which starts October 1st. So we were up from where we were in May significantly. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that we're still $4.2 billion less revenue in fiscal year 21, which starts October 1st, and then the following, FY22 budget as well. So while I'd much rather be where we are today. It's not where we were in January, and we still have a long ways to go to get back to where we want to be on revenues. And that's why I keep, the same message going, that we really do need the federal government to step back up and provide support for our residents, for our businesses, and for state and local governments so that we can provide the services that our people need.
Were you and the governor, and by the way, the governors of a whole lot of states have been very clear that you need the federal government to step up. I mean, there are 50 states, or
Yes.
almost 50 states, that are going to need some kind of help following this pandemic. But we also know what it looks like in Washington. We're coming up to an election here in 9 weeks. We know that the House has offered one thing and says they won't budge. The administration and the Senate have yet another proposal from which they don't seem to want to vary. It's possible, isn't it, that the states don't get that help, or at least not in the short term, or at least not in time for the budget deadline. Isn't that possible?
Well, we're going to build our budget based on what we know. And so we're moving ahead that way. Because we solved the current budget year, fiscal year 20, and we have excess revenue that we just picked up, we're able to pull that money forward and help us reduce our deficit for the coming fiscal year. So that makes that budget easier. We still have a big gap over $1 billion from a budget standpoint for fiscal year 22. But what we're hearing, in DC is that there are some communications, starting. So I'm hopeful. Yes, the House plan is about $3 trillion. The White House and Senate plan is around $1 trillion. There's obviously room to meet in the middle. And so I'm optimistic that something will happen, but I can't count on it to get a budget done for this coming fiscal year, which starts in just about 4 weeks from now. So we're building a budget that will be balanced, and we'll work with the legislature through any outstanding issues we have.
When you talk about the budget, it's a $60 billion. It's a lot of money out there. But explain for people a little bit about what the budgeting process looks like, because there's a whole lot of that revenue that is already earmarked. It's protected. You can't move that around. So when you have to start thinking about cuts, you only have a couple of areas from which to cut, which is GFGP, the general fund, general purpose, or in the education budget, which is generally a place nobody wants to cut.
Yeah, combined the general fund and the school aid fund is about $24.5 billion, give or take, and over 90% of that goes out to schools, colleges, and universities, local government, healthcare. So I'm not sure whom we could cut to make up for big revenue losses. And that's why it really is important that the federal government, step up. I mean, it's really their stimulus, the third stimulus plan that put more money into unemployment, that helped out, our residents, that helped out small businesses, that really brought up our revenues, as well as the governor, really making sure that through her actions, we were able to flatten that curve and we could bring our economy back safely. So that's why we've seen the rise in the revenues, and we need Washington to come together, both Congress and the White House, to provide those needed funds, not just for us, but for our residents, for our businesses, our schools, and yes, for state and local governments across this country.
You're working with the legislature, and we all know what the budget process looked like last year, and it ended up in a place that I'm not sure the legislature or the governor were particularly excited about being in that situation. How are those negotiations going now, understanding that you have a lot shorter period of time? You've just now found out through this last revenue estimating conference how much of a hole you have to deal with. How are those negotiations going, and what kind of cooperation do you think that the Republican-led legislature, Democratic-led administration, what kind of cooperation are you finding?
Well, what we've tried to do is, obviously no one wants to be where we were last October. And I want to say, knock on wood, that we've learned, from that experience. And so we've really stepped up communications back and forth. Since March, we've really been meeting at least bi-weekly, if not weekly, talking to each other. And you saw that progress when we passed a first supplemental bill. Then we were able to quickly, come to agreement on a balanced FY20 budget. And so taking those, positive first steps, we hope will play into getting this budget solved before the end of the fiscal year.
Well, I know you're in negotiations now, and you're not going to negotiate a new budget here with me, but as you look at that budget, and if there isn't federal money involved in there, do you have some type of a contingency plan for some way to, do you just finance programs for as long as you can go, or do you have to start trimming programs? I mean, what is the general plan?
I mean, really, as I said before, because we had so much more revenue for this current fiscal year, about $2.3 billion, and we have already solved the current fiscal year, we're able to pull those dollars forward. And so, the school aid side has a few more $100 million, so they're good. The general fund has several $100 million hole, but we should be able to work through 21. The big question is what's going to happen in fiscal year 20. And that's of concern because we start building that right after we get this done starting in October. So when you're looking at them combined, we should be able through, good negotiations, get to a good place in 21, but it's 22 that we're also keeping our eye on.
That is the take on the budget from the administration's perspective, but what does the Republican-controlled legislature have to say? We'll find out next with House Appropriations Chairman Shane Hernandez. That's next, To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. House Appropriations Chair Shane Hernandez talked to us this week about his take on a new budget. Mr. Chairman, this is an interesting time. We're 4 weeks, as you and I talked, before the deadline for the budget for the 2021 fiscal year. There was some news in a revenue estimating conference from last week that was good news compared to what it had been predicted, but still some shortfalls. Where are we with the budget process right now?
Sure. Well, we have the month of September to finish this up. I'd say the good news is the House and Senate and the administration are at the table working together on this, as we did through the fiscal year 20 budget, the supplemental before that. This is crunch time. There's not a lot of time left, but I think the recent revenue estimating conference shows how important it was to wait till August to get those numbers a little more accurate, because we all thought we were staring down this $3 billion budget hole. And that isn't what we're dealing with. Now, it's a little more complicated than just being, kind of flat revenue. There's some concerns with how much the federal dollars are holding that up and what next year looks like. But it's definitely not the picture we thought it was.
When you think in terms of what you'll need to do to finalize these things, I know as you and I are speaking right now, you have just come from an appropriations meeting, I think. I know you've been meeting with the administration or representatives have been meeting perhaps through the weekend. Are we looking at substantial reductions in some departments, or is there going to be enough money to backfill given the revenues that have come in?
Well, I think right now we absolutely do have to look at some reductions. They're not going to be what we thought they were, but I think it's the responsible thing to do with the budget going forward, knowing that while we may be able to come close to doing a baseline budget based off of last year's budget, what we're facing next year still is a budget deficit, mainly due to the fact that a lot of our revenue right now is based off of withholdings from federal programs, the PPP program, the unemployment program, and at some point those programs are going to end. It's not sustainable to be getting, $43 billion, I think is the number of federal money that came into the state of Michigan. It's not sustainable for that to continue to happen from their end. And we know that's going to end. So I think it's important that we budget for the future. It's not just making sure the investments are where they need to be in our schools and our health and safety right now, but it's for the future as well, knowing that there's a shortfall next year.
Well, we'll get to 2022 in a minute. I talked to the budget director, and he certainly has some concerns about that. But in the immediate future, and I've been around long enough to see some of these things get really protracted and come right down to the last minute. But from what you're telling me and what the budget director had to say, it sounds like the communication is pretty good. And so I'm taking from that the prospects are pretty good that this budget gets done in time for the new fiscal year.
Yeah, definitely. That's been our plan all along. Again, I think we showed with the starting with the supplemental using the remaining CARES Act dollars a couple months ago that we could come back to the table despite differences that are happening policy-wise, so that we could get that done. And then on the fiscal year 20 supplemental, which was a budget reduction to balance our budget, we were able to do that with a unanimous vote of the House and Senate. So I think we've shown that we are approaching this together with the House, Senate, and administration. We'll continue to do that. And if we're going to do what's best for Michigan, that's the only way we can do it.
Well, let's talk about the politics of this a little bit, or at least some of the outside interests that are working, because obviously the state legislature has had a real problem. Republicans in the state legislature have had a real problem with some of the way the governor has handled the COVID-19 response. There's been that on one issue. But even if we go back all the way to a year ago and look at that budget process, that kind of blew up all at the end with a whole lot of things happening that prompted everybody to kind of reset how the budget was going to happen. But even with all of that background and even with what's going on now, you have been able to come together on the supplemental. We were talking about this budget. How hard is it to compartmentalize those things? Because obviously there's some serious differences.
Sure, and there's no doubt we've had our differences. Last year it feels like forever ago that we were talking about road funding and a gas tax. And, we still were able to get that budget done on time. The budget is the one thing that's required of us in the legislature. It's the one thing we do have to come together on. And despite other ongoing differences, there's things that I want to see worked out throughout this budget process. One of my priorities would be seeing our UIA offices have a plan to reopen. These are things I hear about every day in my district. I know other representatives are hearing about it. As we work forward on this budget, this is an opportunity for us to work out some of those other differences as well, possibly. But we've got to keep our eye on the goal, which is making sure that education funding in Michigan is getting out to our local districts. Our local governments are being taken care of as much as possible during this difficult time. Those are the things we really have to focus on and why we come together and make sure we can get this done.
When you talk about the budget, people think about the big number, which is upwards of $60 billion. But the part of the budget that you really have control on is the school aid school fund, the school fund budget, and the general fund general purpose budget. When you look at those as they are for this fiscal year and think about what they're going to look like in the next fiscal year, are those numbers going to be real close?
Yeah, I mean, right now, if you look at the baseline numbers that we've seen from CREC, the school aid fund is actually doing better than the general fund, which is based off of the general fund's based mainly off of income tax. So that one is lagging behind a little bit. The school aid fund is doing okay considering the times. Now, I've always been somebody who will argue the point that those aren't the only two areas that we have control of. And I think we're showing that through some of this. A statutory fund, we're legislators and we write statute. And as we address an issue as big as what we're facing right now, we need to go through those statutory funds. Today, as you mentioned, we were in appropriations committee and we passed several budget implementation bills that were shifting restricted revenues to general fund as we address this issue. And I think we need to continue to look at those areas going forward.
So when you say restricted funds, what type of restricted funds? Where would they be coming from to go to the general fund?
Well, there's countless restricted funds out there, whether they're 21st century job funds and other areas like that are specified for a particular area. There may be funds that are going to a particular area that isn't even operating right now because of COVID. So those are all funds we need to go through. Maybe some of them need to be right-sized. They haven't been looked at for several years. Those are all things that are on the table. I believe we voted on it was 6 or 7 bills today that shifted restricted funds just for 1 year at this point. But I've always been a proponent that those need to be on the table as we work through the budget as well. They were made restricted when legislators made that decision, and they can be changed when legislators make that decision.
Is that something the administration is going to be on board on?
Well, those bills we passed today were part of the fiscal year 20 budget deal. And so those bills passed today unanimously in appropriations, and I hope to continue to have those conversations in fiscal year 21.
As a practical matter, a budget needs to be done prior to October 1st to keep government running as smoothly as possible. And from talking to both sides on this program, an agreement seems likely, though we have seen budget talks break down for a variety of reasons over the years. So we'll continue to watch developments on this front and be back with a final thought next. To the point. In just more than 8 weeks, the election will be over. Between now and then, we'll keep you up to speed on all of the races you'll be deciding this year when you join us each week for To the Point.